punishment and justifying harm. This week, we'll be taking a slightly different approach to the particular topic than we have been doing in previous weeks. Recall in previous weeks, at least for the last 3 or 4, we have essentially focused on articles by particular authors. There's definitely been an overarching topic like charity or parenting, or abortion. But we've pretty much just started out applying that pattern of philosophical inquiry, like what is the problem, what is the question the author is trying to address, etc. Instead of doing that this week, we're going to think through the larger topic itself, and then there are articles from authors this week that everyone will read, and we'll mention those in this video, but the focus will not be on a particular author. Like, for example, what does Peter Singer argue for? That's the typical pattern we've been in. But this week it's more like, what is the notion of punishment at an individual and a state level, and how can that be justified morally? Like, is it always morally okay to punish someone for various actions, or might it sometimes not be okay to punish people? It's a large topic, and the reason for approaching it this way at a more general level than immediately focusing on particular authors is that I've worked with this topic for many years throughout teaching courses like this one, and when I was in graduate school myself taking courses. And it was always challenging to me to understand like the larger picture, like what is really at stake when we're talking about punishment. And whereas if we just focus on 1 or 2 articles, like for example, we could look at articles on just capital punishment, which is what's in our textbook for this week. But if we did that, we'll have a very limited view of the whole notion of punishment in general and why it tends to be morally problematic, or at least something that morality or ethics has to say something about. That we can miss out on a lot if we just focus on like capital punishment. Because at that point, if we just focused on one thing, we would miss like simple things like parents punishing their children, or all the other crimes in a society that are actually punishable. For example, stealing or perjury, like lying, and once one's sworn an oath to tell the truth. There's so many things that humans tend to punish other humans for. And so what's most useful, or I've come to think of as most useful, is to think about the topic in general. And then if a person needs to go forward, or later in life you hear about some various court case or some sentencing, or something like politicians talking about we need prison reform, or that some politicians are supposedly going to be tough on crime, or these various things like local and district policies in your community, local regulations about here's how certain crimes will be punished. In order to understand those things, I think it's most helpful to have a larger view of punishment and the way punishment theorists have approached this topic, and the limitations of what we've been able to accomplish thus far, or at least what the punishment theorists have been able to accomplish thus far. Okay, just as to summarize all of that, instead of focusing on particular authors, this week we'll be looking at the larger topic of punishment in and of itself. To get started, there's always certain central questions that these are reasonable. If you think about the notion of punishment, the very first thing, whether you're doing it, approaching this topic from a philosophical, ethical, historical, social, scientific, whatever perspective one approaches it from, whatever disciplinary field, or practical just job focus, there's always that starting question. Well, what is punishment? When is someone being punished versus when are they not? It seems obvious. Oh yeah, we punish people, they're tossed in jail or something, or a child is spanked. Yes, those could be examples of punishment, but it's not quite that easy. It's not quite that easy, and we'll see that as we go along. So we'll need to know how people have answered this question, like what is punishment in general. The next thing is, what is the purpose of punishments? Like, what are the aims and the goals of particular forms of punishment? Like, why did we punish someone? Or why are we thinking about punishing someone? What is the motive, the intent? Well, then the next thing is, well, what ethically or morally justifies punishment? Like, why is it morally okay, or someone has not done anything wrong when they punish someone else? Or in what cases might they have done something wrong when they punish someone else? And then there's this huge question that comes up quite a bit. Anytime in local politics or national level politics, this kind of question does show up, is like, does punishment actually work at a state level or a federal level? Like, is it effective to punish people in certain kind of ways? Well, what does it mean for a punishment to be effective? Like, that will depend on what our goal or our aim was up here. Like, what is the general aims or goals of punishment? When we ask, does it actually work? Well, that's a question of, did it actually achieve the goal we were after? Did we actually obtain the results that we were aiming for when we punish people? And then finally is, might the consequences of some punishments last too long? Or might they be too short? That the duration, like say that we punish someone, but then there are consequences besides just the punishment that tend to chase that person throughout the rest of their life. But, like say an easy example of this is say that we physically punish someone, say we beat them. This is an extreme example, but say that we beat them for beating someone else. They beat someone else up, we beat them up. But then as a consequence of us beating them up, say that we injured them severely, so they walk with a limp the rest of their days. Or, they lose some sensory functionality. They can't see anymore. Something like that. Well, that's a consequence of the actual punishment. The punishment was the beating of them for beating someone else. And yet there's a long-term, lifelong consequence from that punishment. And so might the consequence be too extreme or last too long for what they initially did? And there's a lot of factors that have to be considered when thinking about that. These are just a few of the major questions, like what is punishment, what's the purpose or the goal of it, how do we justify it morally, ethically, does it actually work, and might the consequences of some punishment last too long? These are just some of the big questions that punishment theory people and people, political reformers, tons of people in the Department of Corrections, law enforcement, etc. These are just some of the big questions that we need to have a sense of, need some answers to, if we're really to understand punishment, and especially if we're to understand the moral or immoral aspects of certain forms of punishment. So let's see if we can find some answers. Fortunately, there's a lot of punishment theorists. There's a lot of people in historical studies, in law enforcement, say criminal justice, criminology, as well as philosophy and ethics. There are lots of people that have contributed trying to generate reasonable answers for these questions. Namely, they'll provide answers to these questions and then offer various reasons and evidence in support of them. We have a lot to choose from, but let's just ease into it slowly but surely. The first question is that, what is punishment exactly? As I said, it seems like an easy thing. We can point to a lot of examples, but it's not so small of a task. For example, say that we take a toy away from a child, and just the action, not worrying about initially just the action of taking that toy away from the kid. Well, the kid may cry and have throw a tantrum or something, but that doesn't really matter. We're focused on just the act of taking the toy. Well, is always taking a toy from a kid that may not want us to take that toy away, is that always a punishment? Maybe not. Imagine if the toy it just fell in the cat's litter box, or it fell on the ground and we know that the child is sure to pick it up and put it in their mouth, as a lot of little children do. They put all kinds of things in their mouths. They pick it up off the ground, put it in their mouth. And we know that there's a potential for that child to be harmed by that, depending on where the toy fell in. Like, say it fell in the toilet or something, and they pick it out of the toilet, and then they're about to put it in their mouth, and so we're like, whoa, and we snatch it out of their hand. Well, we took the toy from them, but did we punish them for anything? Not really. That's not punishment. So just the act of taking a toy from a child, assuming the child doesn't want us to, just the fact that they didn't want us to take that toy and we took it anyway, that does not mean that we punished them. We could have been just trying to protect them. But then say that the child is misbehaving and they're throwing their toys all over the place, and they pick one of them up, and then we take the toy from them. That may very well be punishing. That may be an act of punishment. But in and of itself, until we know more about what we're trying to accomplish with punishment and what it actually means to punish, we can't say that any particular act is necessarily punishment. For example, spanking is a typical example of punishing someone. But there's some people, for better or for worse, that there's fetishes associated with that, where some people like to be spanked. So spanking in and of itself, that act, may or may not be punishment. Also, confining someone, like incarcerating someone for whatever, an action, sometimes that itself may or may not be punishment. It all depends on the context. We'll see that as we go along. But the sort of take-home message from this is to notice that acts in and of themselves with no context may or may not be punishment. We do not know. There's no default things that are just guaranteed to be punishment. We always need more context. And so let's gain a little more context for this. So what besides the mere performance of certain actions goes into making an action punishment? Well, we're in luck. Punishment theorists have already done this work for us. We don't have to struggle to figure that out for ourselves. Typically, anything that counts as punishment will have about 5 characteristics associated with it. These are not necessary and sufficient. Some actions may be punishing, even though they have one of these things or all of these things, do not make it necessarily punishing. There may be more characteristics besides these 5 we're going to talk about needed to classify some actions as punishment. Think of it like a list of criteria, like a checklist. And so we have first, second, third, and then there's fourth, fifth. But the thing is even if something meets all 5 of these, it may still need something more to be punishment. Or it could be that just one of these is enough in some cases. But regardless of the validity of these 5 characteristics as a whole, if something tends to meet a lot of them, most theorists are going to classify that action as a punishment. So let's look at them. The first is typically a punishing type of action will often involve a particular intention or motive. That is, the intent is to inflict some sort of physical or psychological form of deprivation or some kind of pain, some kind of suffering. We're doing something that we know another person isn't especially going to like. We're doing it. We're doing this thing to the person with the intent for them not to like it. It's like punishment. An action tends not to be punishing if the person welcomes it. If they don't find it distasteful or uncomfortable or as a deprivation or painful, if the person being punished or the action performed toward a person, if the person themselves does not perceive it as a punishment, it may very well not be a punishment. But we end up with the intention for them to perceive it as a punishment. We intend for them to, in some kind of way, suffer. Why? Well, we will see. But it's still, there is that intent to harm them in some kind of way. And the idea is we want to harm them in a way that they know it's harmful and that they don't really want it. We don't want them to want what we're doing to them. Just think about that, and that'll probably sound reasonable to you. Simply put, punishment will often involve a conscious and deliberate effort on the part of the punisher to in some way hurt or harm the one being punished. Now, a person may have some hesitations about that and be like, well, pain and suffering, like when I punish my child, I'm not really wanting to cause them necessarily a whole lot of pain and suffering, but I am more like I want them to learn a lesson or various things. But then think back to it, that when we punish our children, typically we do have an intent for them to experience some level of discomfort or some level of intensity that's not very pleasant. It's like typically punishment has a sort of negative reinforcement connotation. It doesn't have to, but this is like the typical. We're trying to capture it in general, and you think about punishment like various times you've punished someone or been punished yourself. The norm seems to be that the person that's doing the punishing will have had an intent to give you negative reinforcement, something that's not very enjoyable for you. Or you, as the deliverer of punishment, was trying to do something to another person, whether it's a little kid or an adult or whatever, that person's not going to find very pleasant. And in sort of theoretical circles, anytime we do something to someone or someone undergoes something that is they don't want to undergo, they don't find very pleasant, that is considered a harm. It may not be a necessarily painful harm, but it's a harm nonetheless. Anytime a person's interest or they have an interest in not standing in the corner for an hour, but yet we make them stand in the corner for an hour. Well, at that point, we have done something contrary to their interests, their wants. Their world and experience is a little less pleasant than it would have otherwise been. And depending on how they perceive it, it could be a whole lot less pleasant. And so that it counts as a harm. Like I've mentioned before, ethics and morality always, it's guaranteed that harm shows up sometime. And in the case of punishing, it seems like the actual intention and the motive behind punishing someone will often be to harm that person in some kind of way. Well, that's enough to immediately make this a moral, ethical concern. It's like typically the intent to punish is not thought to be terrible, but yet the intent or motive to actively harm someone or cause them discomfort, typically the default in ethics and morality is to say, yeah, that's not good. And yet we punish. And we typically don't perceive punishment as a bad thing. So having an intent or a motive to cause someone a sort of physical, psychological distress, to act in a way or force them in a situation that is contrary to their interest, That tends to be an aspect of most forms of punishment. An action like that's what makes taking the toy from the child after the toy fell in the litter box or the toilet, that's what makes that not punishing, is we're not intending to hurt or harm the child. We're not trying to make their world less pleasant. That is not our intent. Our intent by taking the toy away is to protect them from harm, not cause them harm. So just keep that in mind. It's an interesting aspect of punishment. Right out of the gate, punishment's interesting because it typically involves an intent to bring about some sort of harm or some form of results that are contrary to the interest of the person that's being punished. It's extremely interesting to think about that. Or it at least is to me. Maybe not to everybody, but it is to me just to think that from a sort of ethical moral point of view, that morality is just, and ethics, all of these types of discussions are almost always focus on, yeah, it's bad to harm. We don't want to harm people. People that are being harmed, that's a bad thing. And yet the very notion of punishment seems to almost require the intention to harm. Otherwise, an action isn't punishing. Just think about it. It's neat. Next, a second characteristic of, like, when we're trying to say, is an action actually punishment or not? What is punishment? The second characteristic is often that the person doing the punishment, the punisher, typically is doing that action because they have judged the person receiving the punishment as having done something wrong. That person is guilty of some behavior. They are guilty of breaking a rule. They're guilty of, just breaking the law, breaking rules. And they've been adjudicated guilty. Like the person doing the punishing will typically say, if it's a one-on-one basis, like parent to child, that why is the child punished? Well, because we have a rule in the house that you don't hit your sibling, you don't hit your little brother or your little sister, and yet the child did that. So the child broke a rule that's in the house. They're guilty of breaking the rule. And so they're punished. One of the reasons for punishing them is because they're guilty of breaking the rule. That tends to be a second aspect of punishment. And think about it when we talk about like criminal punishment. Typically, a person's arrested for a crime. Well, a crime just is a case of rule breaking. That's what all a crime is legally there's a law that says that there's various laws that say what we can and cannot do legally, and then we act contrary to those laws, and if we are judged guilty of having done so, there's enough evidence to support the claim that we are in fact guilty, and then at that point, it's like, oh, we can punish that. But we tend not to punish a person prior to actually being adjudicated guilty. I mean, it's iffy. This is in contemporary society. Sometimes just the build up to the case, to the trial of even being punished is horrific and extremely, suffering based for the persons involved. So it's like, in some sense, maybe they are being punished before they're ever adjudicated one way or another. So that's a little iffy. But typically, like in a sort of theoretical sense, that punishment, what makes an action punishing is the fact that somebody is judged of an individual as guilty, and then there's an action as a consequence. Given that you're guilty, now we do something to you. That tends to be a characteristic. Like I say, though, there's a little bit of wishy-washy, squishy to this characteristic. I didn't say that any of these are absolutely perfect, but they are typical when we're thinking about an action being punishing. And then third, and this ties into the first one, or to the second one about someone is adjudicated guilty. Well, this third one is that we actually punish someone not just because they're guilty, but because they overtly did something that's against the rules. They've committed an offense against the rule. And that's where it comes up, where a case of so how do we set this up? We'll just read this. That to locate support for this idea, one need only think about the act of incarcerating a person. Incarcerating someone, like putting them in jail or confining them, not necessarily jail, just confining someone, doesn't necessarily constitute a case of punishment. So contrast the case of someone who kidnaps a teenager at random, locks him or her in the basement for years, with the case of a teenager who's sent to his or her room for the rest of the night for talking back to a parent. Both involve forms of incarceration, like confining someone against their will. But only the one where the parent sends the teenager to the room is properly seems to be a punishment. Whereas the other one of some kid is kidnapped and locked in a dark basement for years, that seems more like torture. That teenager that's randomly grabbed off the street and thrown in the basement, they're not really being punished for anything because they didn't break any rules. Or let's assume they didn't. Assume this is just some random person that, kidnaps teenagers. And the idea is the teenager may not have broken any rules. They didn't commit any offense against any rules, and so, but they're incarcerated. Well, their incarceration is not a form of punishment. It may very well be a form of torture, but it is unwarranted. This person didn't break any rules, whereas the teenager that may talk back to mom or dad or grandma, and then that teenager is sent to their room, their phone is taken away, their internet access is taken away. Those sorts of things, those taking away actions are because the teenager talked back. And maybe there's a certain rule in the household. You don't talk back to your parents or your grandparents. You respect your parents and your grandparents or whoever in this household, and you didn't do that. So that's an offense against some rules that were promulgated, that were made known. It's like a person has to know the rules and then overtly break the rules, and then they've committed an offense against the rules, so we punish them. They are being the less than ideal state that they're being pushed into, like no phone for a week or whatever. That's contrary to their interests, their wants, their desires, and we're doing it because they broke rules. That's an aspect of punishment. Another thing that's associated with punishment typically is that we punish in order to express like our disapproval or condemnation of whatever the action is. It's not just that they broke the rule, but we punish so that they really get the message. Yeah, this is not acceptable. We don't like this behavior. You did it anyway. You were wrong for having done it that way, or we at least think you were, and so you were bad. I mean, it is kind of that simple, is that sometimes we punish just to send that message, to say, yep, this is bad, we do not approve, we don't want you to do this, so you have to suffer these consequences. Why? Well, because we disapprove of what you did. That's the idea of expressing disapproval or condemnation. That typically is associated with punishment. Just think back to, if we did not disapprove of the action of a child hitting their siblings, then why would we punish them? It's like we punished. A lot of times we talk about this in terms of like raising the child or teaching them right from wrong. Well, punishing is one way that happens sometimes. That we punish with the intent to make their world a little less ideal than it would otherwise be. But we also do it to let them know that, yeah, these actions are condemnable, that they're not actions that we approve of as parents or sometimes as friends or as a society as a whole, when we're talking about, punishing people for stealing or punishing people for speeding. That there's a condemnation to that, is, yeah, you did something wrong. But it doesn't necessarily have to be legal. It could be a moral offense. It could be a legal offense. It could just be a family offense, like talking back to your parents. It may not be immoral to talk back to one's parents. It certainly doesn't seem to be illegal to do so, but it could very well be anti-family as far as the rules of that household go. So that's a way to express disapproval, condemnation. We do not like what you did. You did wrong. That's why you're being punished. Finally, this is an interesting aspect of it, is that many cases of punishment would be administered by someone other than the offender. It's like typically sometimes we think, like, oh yeah, I really punished myself or I beat myself up for that mistake. We do think like that at times. Humans do. That we're like, man, I really messed up there. And then we kind of beat on ourselves psychologically for, whoa, that was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. Why did I do that? And so we do, in a sense, psychologically punish ourselves for perceived mistakes. But typically with punishment, we tend to think of it not as something that is self-inflicted, is more as something that's other afflicted. Like somebody breaks a rule and then someone else punishes them for it. Just think of typical criminal acts like, someone steals something and then law enforcement captures them. Then they end up going to court and the judges or juries, they're sentenced. They're adjudicated guilty, then they're sentenced. And then it'll be some other group of people. It could be if it was a bad enough theft, they may end up in jail or in prison. And then that's prison guards that are confining them. So that's far, far removed from the actual offender. These are people the offender may not know at all, and yet they're administering punishment. So a sort of norm is punishment is typically handed out by someone besides the offender. Typically, the person who's being punished is not the same one punishing themselves. We can do that. We can psychologically kind of punish ourselves for mistakes. But typically, when we're talking about punishment in the context of punishment theories, it's normally there's someone that is adjudicated guilty of breaking some rule, then there's someone else that's handing out the punishment based off of that rule breaking. So, and these 5 characteristics, as I've said and emphasized, they're not necessarily wholly sufficient to say something is punishment or to classify an action as punishment, but they do go a long way. They get us closer than we were when we first started this video of seeing that, yeah, things that meet these conditions do seem sort of punishing. Like if someone is acting in a way towards someone else and they have the intention to harm that person in some kind of way. They want to make that person's world a little less ideal than it would otherwise be. So we have someone that has this intent to make someone else's world less pleasant. They intend to harm them in some kind of way. Well, then we also have the person that's about to be punished. They're actually guilty of something. They did something that is, contrary to certain rules that are already in play. And that act of punishing them is meant to communicate some sense of disapproval or condemnation. And typically that person isn't going to be responsible for spanking themselves. No, someone else is going to spank them for it. If you put all 5 of those things together, you gain a kind of handle on what actions would count as punishing versus which ones wouldn't. I encourage people, think through these, think of examples of just typical actions that you would, or events that you would consider like cases where you've been punished in the past or you've been handing out punishment to other people, and see if most of these characteristics didn't show up in that event. And then think of other cases that you would say, no, I wasn't punished, even though, say, someone did something to you that might have been kind of harmful. Like, think about if you played a contact sport. Like, if you go on a football field and you run out there and then some giant lineman just smashed you into the ground. Well, was that lineman punishing you? Well, no, not really. Did they intend to harm you? Well, maybe they did because we're on opposing teams, or to make our world a little less pleasant. Maybe they did intend that, but did they do it because I was guilty of anything? Not really. I mean, maybe I'm guilty of being a member of the other team, but did I break any rules? Did I get tackled and driven down into the dirt because I broke any rules of the game of football? No. In fact, it's part of the rules of the game that within those rules, people tackle other people. And did that player did the lineman that tackled me, did they want to punish me? Was their intent of tackling me to express disapproval for something I'd done? Well, no, not necessarily. It's just part of the game. They're not condemning me for anything by tackling me. And then, was it handed out by someone besides me? Yeah, the lineman. But notice that given that I didn't do any rule breaking, or they weren't really trying to express disapproval, it's like without those two things, it kind of seems, well, yeah, that wasn't really punishment, even though it might have hurt, even though the person may have intended for it to hurt. It's not punishment if it doesn't meet most of these things. All of these tend to have to be in play for an action to be punishing. They don't always have to be, but they typically are. They're a good start, at least. You can build a sort of working operational understanding of that acts that would count as punishment versus those that wouldn't by thinking of things that meet these characteristics and things that don't. Now we enter the sort of morality, the ethics of punishment. And this is where things become extremely interesting. That, as I mentioned, that first characteristic, most people, especially ethicists, have a tendency to think that intentionally attempting to harm someone is immoral. It's unethical. And yet, that very first condition, the an act of punishment, often involves intentionally attempting to harm someone, trying to make their world a little less decent than it would otherwise be. And so it would seem to follow that we should think that punishment's immoral, shouldn't we? If the default is to say that intending to harm someone is kind of a bad motive, or as like Immanuel Kant that we looked at earlier in this semester, we're supposed to always act with goodwill. Well, that means an intention to fulfill our duties, to demonstrate the utmost respect for someone. And yet, if we intend to harm that person, are we really intending to respect them? Initially, it might not seem that way. And so the idea is typically in ethics, intending to harm someone and that being the motive for your action is typically thought to be pretty morally bad. And yet punishment, by its very nature, what makes an action punishing is the fact that the punisher often has an intent to harm me. Say I'm the one that's about to receive the punishment. Well, the person that's doing it will intend to create an unpleasant situation for me. And that unpleasant situation, we can think of that as a harm. It's maybe a minimal harm, or it could be a major harm, but either way, it could be called a harm. And so it's typically bad to intend to harm someone, and yet in punishment, that's what's typically in play. So wouldn't the default be to say that punishment is like the at first sight determination should be, shouldn't it, that punishment's not morally okay? And yet, most everybody's going to think that punishment's perfectly fine. How do we get around that? That's one of the neatest aspects of punishment. Yeah, so how is it that people can tend to think that actions involving an intentional attempt to harm someone are immoral, while at the same time holding to the idea that punishment is moral? Are people being consistent or inconsistent? Are people being essentially walking contradictions? Like, are all of us actually walking around with two sets of moral values and two sets of moral determinations that are actually in conflict? Like, if we tend to think that harming someone's bad, that's not good. I mean, it's got the presumption of moral badness or unethical. I mean, that does tend to be the default of most jobs we have. I mean, that's like, think of, for example, engineering, that everyone can look back to that code of engineering, professional engineering ethics from the very first semester. And if you look at each one of those sort of principles and norms, every one of those is, if you just read them, every one of them is about, yeah, you don't do things that harm other people. You never do things where you intend to harm other people. Public safety is number one. Keeping people safe, not causing people distress, not harming people. That's like just written large in almost any code of ethics you'll ever find. Any code of ethics one will almost ever find tends to assume that harming people is of disvalue. It's not morally okay to do something with the intent to harm someone. And yet, punishment, for an action to be punishment, it often involves an intent to harm someone in some kind of way, to make their world a little less pleasant than it would otherwise be. And then we add in this third aspect, that most people do not consider punishment to be immoral or morally bad. Well, how can that be? It's like, isn't that a contradiction? Like, we have P and not P, and we're holding both of them at exactly the same time in our head. How do we rectify that? Because we wouldn't want to be inconsistent in life. It's like we would, that's the sort of philosophical presumption or ethical presumption, is we always want to be consistent. That we don't want to say, yeah, this thing's bad, but then over here there's some other scenario where that thing's happening, but we say, yeah, that's not bad there. Well, why not? If it was bad in one place, why wouldn't it be bad over here? Especially when the intent is the same in both cases. And then it's like, this is a little iffy morally. This is potentially one of the most interesting aspects of punishment. And this is what punishment theorists tend to focus on, is this idea of how do we resolve this seeming inconsistency. We tend to think punishment's okay, but it typically involves an intent to harm that we almost always morally condemn in any other situation. So how do we resolve that? Well, let's move forward. Well, what we have to do is that sort of walking contradiction aspect of punishment and the intent behind it in most cases requires that we figure out a way to morally justify harming people in some cases. The idea is we need a moral justification to say that, yeah, it's okay for us to harm people and intend to harm them sometimes because they harm somebody else. Think about that. That is just immediately just sketchy. Where think back to the parent-child scenario. Say that my son hits his little sister. Well, he harmed his sister. I mean, that's her world is a lot less ideal than it would otherwise be, because son decides, yep, let's hit little sister. Well, he harmed her. So then what happens? Well, dad or mom comes in and is like, oh no, you did wrong. Now I'm going to harm you back. So I'm going to harm you as punishment for harming this other person. And the idea is we're punishing the child for hitting sister because that's an act of harm, and that's a bad thing. You shouldn't harm your little sister. And yet, as a parent, we're going to come in and harm the child as punishment. So But harming was wrong, right? That's exactly why we're punishing the child, is because having the intent to harm was bad. And yet we're going to use the same kind of intent to harm the child. This is why you've got to justify punishment. It's one of the many reasons, but it's one of the major ones. Well, let's walk into how do we justify this? This idea of how is it morally okay? This is a key question that all moral theories about punishment are going to try to answer, is this question right here. How can it be morally okay for a person or group of people to harm an individual for having harmed or attempting to harm someone else? How can it be okay for us to harm someone because they harmed someone else? Especially when we're assuming that harming other people is wrong by default, either way you go. How can it be okay to harm in one case but not in the other? How can it be that we're justified in harming someone because harming's bad, and yet we're going to harm them back? There just has to be some justification there. Well, there's a lot of ways one might try to justify punishment. We'll look at some of the major sort of theories, the sort of categories of ways you can try to justify it and say, yeah, it's okay to harm someone for the harm they caused. And then we need some reasons like because. And that's what all these theories are trying to do. You could it's approached in literature, like in the literature and research of punishment. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to like consequentialist versus non-consequentialist theories of punishment. We're not really going to get hung up in that distinction. We're going to approach it in a slightly different way in terms of just some of these major classifications. And I'm not going to read through all of these ways that the theories are built. Everyone will have this handout so they can read through it. We'll just jump in. The main thing to note is that each of these theories tries to provide an answer to the question of why is it okay to punish? How is punishment morally justified? Why is it okay for us as the punishers to intend to harm someone and to actually cause about some kind of harm in most cases to someone because they've harmed someone else? How can we do that without being a walking contradiction? Well, one theory, the very first one, is harm reduction, is that punishment is okay. It's okay for us to harm someone else if the act of doing that creates an overall reduction of harm for everybody involved. So, say harms within a community that obviously raping, murdering, kidnapping, burglaries, those are harms. They're not morally good. They're typically considered morally bad. I mean, there's debate about that, but typically the default is, yeah, those things right there, those are harmful. They're not good. And so they're a harm. And so anybody who does those things, why is it okay for us to harm them? Well, because by harming them, it reduces the overall amount of harms that are committed in our community. By punishing murderers and rapists and thieves, we reduce the whole overall level of harm for everybody else involved. That has a consequentialist feel to it, though, that we're trying to achieve a scenario of the best for the most. Less harm is better for the most people. So we harm an individual in order to reduce harm for all other individuals in the community. That's one theory. And it's very much related to this notion of deterrence. Say that somebody's crime doesn't necessarily, it's not really all that harmful, but we don't want people to do it. So another way to think about this sort of way of why is it okay to punish? Well, it's okay to punish in cases where it deters people from doing things that we don't want them to do. Like, say, spray painting on an abandoned building, the side of a building. Well, there's laws against that. And if people are caught doing it, they could very well receive some kind of punishment for doing it. But is that person spray painting on that building that's just like been reclaimed by the city, that's being planned to be torn down and something else built there eventually? I mean, has any direct harm been done to anybody around? Maybe not. But we don't want people doing that for whatever reason. Maybe people driving through the community that may be thinking about buying it, they don't want to see buildings with a whole bunch of spray painted stuff on the side of it, that they may have a negative impression of that neighborhood. And as a city, maybe we want developers to be attracted to a neighborhood. But if they see a bunch of spray paint on the walls and they don't really know the difference between various gang symbols or whatever, they may just associate all that spray painting, all that tagging with, yeah, this is like a gang-based neighborhood and I don't want to put my business here. Now, there's a safety issue with that. But the tagging itself might be totally innocent. It could be just kids drawing on the walls with spray paint. But a developer may not know that if they're not from that community. And so a city wants to deter people from doing the spray painting, even though there's not a perfectly direct line of harm to anybody. The city may just not get the contracts or the bids that it would like to receive to develop that area, which could harm the larger community. There's typically a harm lurking almost anywhere when we think about punishing people for something. But sometimes it's not immediately direct, like, little Billy hits his sister, or little sister hits little Billy. Those seem like immediate, physical contact harm. But spray painting on buildings that are going to be demolished anyway, that has a sort of indirect harm maybe. But yet we'll still punish people for it. Well, how do we justify that? Well, to deter. We don't want a whole lot of people doing that. So we punish some of them, whoever we can catch, in order for the message to get out in the community. Like, oh yeah, if you go spray paint on those buildings, here's the punishment, and it's no fun. So that has a deterrent effect. It turns people who would have done the action we don't want people to do away from doing it before they do. So it's like a preventative strike or a preemptive strike. That punishment is justified insofar as it deters people from doing, things that we don't want them to do. Or punishment is justified insofar as it reduces the overall harm for our communities or for a smaller group of people. This is one theory. This is another one. But every one of these theories has given us a reason for why it's okay to punish. Also, restitution, restorative. That we punish people, that punishment could be justified insofar as it rights various wrongs. So it's wrong for someone to steal from someone. We punish a person and force them, say, to pay the person they stole from back the value of the item they stole, or we force them to return that item. At that point, a wrong was committed, the item was taken, and then we correct it, we righten the scales of justice by making them give it back. So there's a restorative quality that whatever the crime happened to be, it took something from the victim of the crime. And so we punish as a way of getting that victim back what was taken from them. That's one way to think. Why is punishing okay? Why is it morally justified to harm someone that's harmed another person? Well, it's okay insofar as we're punishing them with the intent to correct that wrong. We're trying to force the criminal to make restitution for their actions, to replace what was taken, to make amends. So punishment might be justified insofar as it restores things back to the state that they were at before that bad action occurred. Also, punishment might be justified for rehabilitative purposes. Punishment is justified insofar as it helps offenders develop more socially communally accepted habits. Recurrent and acceptable ways of acting and behaving. Yeah, and so this approaches things from a slightly different perspective to say, why is it okay to punish this person? Well, this person, by their actions, has demonstrated some bad habits. As far as the community is concerned, these things they did, that indicates bad habits. Well, that indicates that they need our help. We're not trying to restore things back to the way they were before. Instead, we are punishing in order to correct a person in our community whose habits are not consistent or harmonious with the habits we would prefer people have in our community. That's the notion of rehab. That we look at the offender or the person that committed the deed, the harmful deed to someone else, we look at that person as someone in need of our help. We don't look at them as someone that's like malicious or evil or whatever. It's more like their actions indicate that they possess certain socially communally unacceptable habits, ways of behaving. And we care about their well-being, so we punish them in order to rehabilitate them, to rehabit them. I don't know if people have ever paid attention to that notion, but that right there, that habit, that's habit. That's what rehabilitation is all about, is we are trying to give people different habits, learn how to develop different ways of behaving in the world. That's what we're doing. We're rehabilitating them. And when you were doing that, typically a rehab perspective as a justification for punishment is looking at the person as, yeah, they did something, they made mistakes, or they did something really, really bad. But that's an indication of, well, that person just has bad habits that we can fix. So we try to give them new habits through various programs, various interventions, counseling, etc. And so if we're punishing in order to get them more acceptable habits, to help them develop more acceptable habits, then it could be totally justified, according to rehab theorists of punishment, at least. Notice that each of these is a whole different group of theorists. Social values. This is an interesting sort of approach to punishment. Like, why is punishment morally okay or justified? Or when is it justified? Well, it's justified insofar as it strengthens our overall values. It emphasizes to everybody in the community, when we punish the wrongdoers, for example, we punish the wrongdoers in an effort to re-emphasize what we find valuable or disvaluable in a community. For example, we find, say, human life very valuable. Well, in the ending of human life without good reason, we find of great disvalue. Well, so say that we punish someone who kills someone. Well, we don't punish them. We punish them for the killing, but the purpose of the punishment isn't so much to correct that person's behavior. We don't really care about that individual's behavior. What we care about is we want a larger message to be translated out in the community by our act of punishing the individual. We want everybody to be our values reaffirmed across everybody. Like, yeah, this person killed one of us. We incarcerate them, or maybe we kill them back if it's capital punishment. But we're punishing that person in an effort to show everyone in the community, yeah, that action was not acceptable. That action is not good. We do not want that in our community. That is contrary to our values. That can be one way in which punishment is justified, according to certain theorists. That punishment is justified insofar as it actually does strengthen communal values and disvalues. And then we're into the really neat ones, the retributivism. All these are interesting. But these are the ones people will often know about, is retributivism. There are three forms. There are many forms. These are just three of them. There's victim retributivism. There is community retributivism. Then there is offender retributivism. And so let's take a careful look at these. All forms of retributivism assume that people deserve certain things, that actions earn us certain things in return, that when we act in a certain kind of way, that entitles us or someone else or some larger entity to certain things, that it creates this relationship of debt, that somebody needs to be paid something back. That say I go to the store, I pick up, I don't know, whatever, a package of potato chips, and by picking that package of potato chips up, if I want to walk out of the door with them, I owe that clerk a certain amount of money because those are not my potato chips until I pay for them. So that notion of paying and owing, like the store is owed a certain amount of money before I'm able to walk out of the store with that bag of potato chips. That sort of, I am in debt to the store for the amount, printed on the bag or whatever the price tag is. I am in debt to the store for that until I give them the money. And then I can go out of the store. It's mine then. So retributivism works on that same kind of assumption that people are owed certain things based on what they do. So for victim retributivism, punishment is justified insofar as it gives the victim of the crime whatever he or she deserves. When a harm occurs, the victim earns and is entitled to something from the offender, namely repayment for the harm done to him or her. The offender owes the victim. That's victim retributivism. So why is it okay to say punish? Let's just go back to the child example. Little Sally hits little Billy, in the eye, the two siblings. Well, the idea would be, why would it be okay for parent to come in and punish little Sally? Well, little Billy got hit. Little Billy's the victim in this case. When Sally hit Billy, the harm she caused Billy puts her in his debt. Little Billy is owed something from Sally. That little Billy deserves or is entitled to something because of what Sally did to him. And it's Sally that owes him. Like being hurt by someone else makes the person that hurt you, they owe you now. They did wrong by you, so they need to make it right. Or they need to be punished for what they did at least. You deserve that. You're entitled to that. A lot of times is where people talk about the notion of victims' rights, or that that justice needs to be made. We need to make sure the victims of a crime receive what's due to them based on this other person or group having done them wrong. That's the notion of victim retributivism. His punishment is justified insofar as it makes sure that the victim of the crime gets what they're owed. That's interesting, the way that it works. And so you can think of this in your old standard eye for an eye scenario where, say that one person hits someone and the person that gets hit, they go blind in one eye. Well, then what is owed to that person? Well, it could very well be that the person who did the hitting, they owe the person who lost their sight, well, they owe that person's sight back. So we may try to do that in a lot of ways. We may try to make that person pay for, say, a robotic eye, if such existed, for the person that lost their eyesight. Or we could just say, well, we don't know how to do that yet, so we'll just make the person who blinded one person, we'll make that person blind in their eye. So, that's like the old eye for an eye notion. Is that why is it okay to blind the offender? Well, because they blinded the other person and that was owed to the victim. Typically the eye for an eye, it sounds a little weird, in terms of who owes what and deserts, but it can be interpreted as a form of victim retributivism. But either way you go, the most important thing to keep in mind about victim retributivism is that the victim is owed something. And as long as we are punishing in order to make sure the victim gets what they're owed, then punishment's okay, according to victim retributivist theorists. Community retributivism is that punishment is justified insofar as it gets the community as a whole what it deserves. So how does this work? Someone is in our community, they do something wrong. Like say that there's a local community center and the members of the community go there for various gatherings, various parties. They hold community meetings there. And then say some member of the community comes in, or outside the community comes in, and they, burn the building down. Well, that has done a harm to all of the community. And so when we punish the person that burned the building down, that punishment could be justified insofar as it's getting the community what they're owed for this person having burned the building down. So we could punish that person by, incarcerating them or making them pay, like demanding that they pay to rebuild this community center for the rest of their lives. But it's a retributivism. It's getting back what's owed to the community. That by burning that building down, the person who did the burning went in debt to the community as a whole. It's like they took a bag of potato chips without paying for it. In this case, they took a whole building and community center without paying for it. So we're justified in punishing them to the effect that we make sure they pay everybody in that community back. But it's a community as a whole. It's not like just one victim. It's a whole group of victims. That's community retributivism. Now, one of the neat ones that we often don't think about, but it shows up a lot, is offender retributivism.